We are obsessed with motion. We always have been. When we tell the story of ourselves, the human species, it is a relentless highlight reel of exploration. We walked out of Africa. We scattered across Eurasia. We figured out boats and navigated the ancient stormy seas to Australia. Every time you open a history book, you are reading about people who refused to stay put. People who looked at a mountain range or a forbidding sea and said, yes, we are going over that. Movement is the mandate. Movement is survival. So when we come to the final greatest chapter of human colonization, the entry into the Americas, we expect the absolute peak of that restless pioneering spirit. We imagine the last great pioneers, the ultimate survivors, finally breaking through the ice and charging south, driven by a primal need to claim the last empty land on Earth. We visualize a furious sprint, a colonization completed in a geological blink. And for the most part, we are right. When that initial breakthrough did happen, the speed was terrifying. We are talking about 2 massive continents colonized from top to bottom faster than most modern empires were built. But what we tend to forget, what we gloss over in the excitement of that final sprint, is the vast, silent age that preceded it. The time when our ancestors, the people whose DNA flows directly through the veins of every indigenous American, stood completely still. We are talking about the secret history of Beringia, not the land bridge we imagine, a quick muddy pathway between continents, but a giant, terrifying country, a colossal, inhospitable holding pen where humanity was forced to wait out a cosmic jail sentence. Imagine the commitment it took just to get there. You and your people have just conquered the brutal, high-altitude steppes of Siberia. You have learned how to survive winters that would instantly kill every person listening to this right now. You are following the massive herds, woolly mammoths, giant bison, reindeer, and the chase has led you inexorably east. Your entire known world is ice and stone, but you are masters of that world. And then, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 years ago, you step onto a landmass that doesn't exist today. Beringia. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, LGM, vast amounts of the world's water were locked up in 2 monolithic ice sheets covering North America, the Laurentide in the east and the Cordilleran in the west. The sea level dropped dramatically, up to 400 feet lower than it is now, and the shallow continental shelf between what is now Russia and Alaska was exposed. This wasn't a fragile strip of land. This was a territory the size of Texas, stretching for thousands of miles. You have reached the edge of the new world. You have crossed the ultimate boundary, but you couldn't go anywhere. The great ice sheets were not simply frozen ground. They were mountains of compression, miles high, impenetrable, grinding, and violently unstable. There was no passage south. The gate was not locked. It was sealed with an ancient geological wall that stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So, the ancestors of the first peoples of the Americas did the one thing that contradicts every defining evolutionary trait we possess. They stopped. They settled down in Beringia, and they stayed there for an unimaginable stretch of time. This isn't a theory. This is written in the deepest parts of our genetics. Molecular anthropologists studying the unique markers, haplogroups, found in indigenous populations across the Americas consistently point to a deep bottleneck event, a period where a relatively small, isolated population diverged significantly from their Siberian cousins. How long was this stop? Academics generally agree that this Beringian Standstill or incubation period lasted somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years. Let that sink in. 5,000 years ago, the pyramids of Giza were being built. 10,000 years ago, we were still figuring out how to farm. These people, standing on the threshold of the final frontier, pressed pause on human expansion for a duration longer than the entire recorded history of civilization as we currently know it. This period of forced isolation radically altered who they were. They were trapped ecologically and geographically in an environment we now struggle to even visualize. Forget the romantic idea of a barren, pristine wasteland. Beringia was not entirely covered in deep ice. Instead, it was dominated by the Mammoth Steppe, one of the most unique and productive grasslands ever to exist. The air was dry, swept clean by fierce winds, and the cold was relentless, unforgiving. But the sun and soil allowed for certain grasses and sedges to flourish. This was the engine that fed the largest collection of megafauna the world has ever seen. Herds of mammoths, musk oxen, woolly rhinos, ancient horses. Survival here required a specialization so profound it rewrote the human instruction manual. They didn't just survive, they became masters of this bizarre, frozen interior world. We know they were hunting the great beasts, relying on sophisticated stone tools and their absolute knowledge of the migratory patterns of massive, dangerous game. But they were doing more than just hunting. They were building a culture, telling stories, and adapting. Generation after generation, the only horizon they knew was the edge of that frozen steppe, hemmed in by the two great ice walls to the south and the rising ocean to the north and west. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing that freedom, a continent of untouched rivers, forests, and valleys, lay just beyond a barrier that no amount of courage, skill, or ingenuity could break. The ice was literally laughing at them. They were pioneers who had run out of road, explorers who had hit the dead end of a frozen epoch. They were trapped in a brutal, productive, lonely vacuum, incubating in the final, cold silence of the Ice Age. And here is where the history becomes truly dark, truly mysterious. For 10,000 years, while the rest of humanity was slowly, painstakingly innovating its way out of the Stone Age, these people were static, fixed in a single brutal ecological niche. Their culture, their toolkit, their social structures, they were adapted solely for this narrow corridor of frozen grassland. The rest of the world moved forward. They waited, and then the ice began to melt. Slowly, painfully, the planet warmed. The climate that had created Beringia began to destroy it, drowning the land bridge beneath the sea. But critically, the same warming trend that closed the door behind them eventually started to crack the wall ahead of them. The great glaciers of North America began to recede, or perhaps the coastal environment became marginally navigable by boat. Whether it was a narrow ice-free corridor opening up through the interior, or a coastal path finally becoming viable. Suddenly, after 10,000 years of silence, the gate was ajar. The call to move, the primal mandate that had been suppressed for millennia, returned. They burst out, driven south in that phenomenal continental sprint we mentioned earlier. They colonized the entire Western Hemisphere in a few thousand years. But what did those 10,000 years in the cold darkness do to the people who waited? What kind of civilization do you forge when your entire purpose is defined by radical, imposed isolation? What secrets did they carry out of Beringia, and what did they leave behind when the land itself was swallowed by the sea? Because the archaeological record suggests that the people who emerged from that long silence, the true ancestors of the first peoples, were profoundly different from the pioneers who entered. They had changed, and they left almost no trace of their long incubation period, as if they had never existed at all. The gate wasn't just closed, it was sealed by two colossal shimmering white armies that had merged into one unstoppable, non-negotiable wall. To understand the 10,000 years of deep silence, the Beringian Standstill, you have to wipe your mental map clean of everything you think you know about geography. We are not talking about a narrow strip of land you might cross on a holiday cruise. Beringia wasn't a bridge, it was a continent. A vast, frozen ecosystem that at its peak was larger than Texas and Alaska combined. It swallowed the modern-day Bering Strait whole and stretched for thousands of miles. and you were stuck right in the middle of it. Imagine walking the Earth at 25,000 BCE. The world you inhabit is dominated by ice. The sea levels have dropped by nearly 400 feet, locking all that water up in the great glacial sheets. We know the original pioneers, the people who first walked out of Siberia and onto this new landmass, had done so because the opportunity arose. They were following the massive herds of megafauna. But then the world shuddered. To the east, spanning Canada and pushing deep into the current U.S. Midwest, stood the Laurentide ice sheet, a slow-moving, mile-thick destroyer of landscapes. To the west, clinging to the Rockies, was the Cordilleran ice sheet. Crucially, around 24,000 years ago, these two monstrous ice formations locked hands, merging into an impenetrable frozen barrier that separated you completely from the rest of the unglaciated Americas. You were walled in. But here is where the history gets strange and the geography plays a cruel trick. If you picture this era as one continuous sheet of white, you're missing the essential survival mechanism. Beringia itself, the actual landmass where these people lived, was mostly unglaciated. It was too far north and too dry. It was a polar desert, yes, but its defining feature was the Mammoth Steppe, a grassland environment maintained by extremely dry, cold conditions. This was the larder. This was your prison yard. You, one of perhaps a few hundred or a few thousand souls, were wandering this treeless, windswept grassland, surrounded by herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, ancient bison, and reindeer. Your whole life, the rhythm of your tribe, was defined by the relentless pursuit of those animals across a land that offered no shelter, only rock, frozen earth, and the constant biting wind. Now, let's look at the scientific evidence for this forced incarceration. The proof that you didn't just walk across a bridge and keep going, but that you were forced to stop and wait. This is where the genetic data becomes absolutely unarguable. When geneticists map the mitochondrial DNA, which tracks maternal lineage, and the Y chromosome, paternal lineage, of modern Native American populations, they see something phenomenal, a long biological pause. If people had simply walked across Beringia and immediately spread south, their genetic material would show continuous divergence, constant mutation rates, and regional clustering that reflects a steady stream of colonization. Instead, the genetic hourglass seems to stop. For 10,000 years, roughly from 24,000 BCE to 14,000 BCE, the genetic markers common to all First Peoples show a period of radical internal mixing and evolution, but virtually zero external influence. It is the signature of a small founding population trapped in a tight geographic space, isolated from their relatives back in Siberia, and blocked from proceeding forward. Academics call this the Beringian Standstill hypothesis, but you can just call it the incubator. You were cut off. Your only social network was the few dozen people in your hunting band. Your only news came from the movement of the bison. Think about the psychological toll of this enforced stagnation. 10,000 years. That is more time than separates us today from the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia. For 400 generations, your entire cultural identity was defined by managing the same resources, perfecting the same hunting techniques, and singing the same songs within the confines of that steppe. There was no one else to trade with, no new ideas coming in from the outside world, no revolutionary way to tie a knot or shape a stone. If your technology was efficient enough to keep you alive, it became sacred tradition, locked in amber. Innovation wasn't rewarded. Deviation meant death. The cold demanded absolute adherence to tradition. What does that do to a culture? It forces depth over breadth. Survival becomes a hyper-specialized art form, and this leads us back to the great mystery, the archaeological black hole. If thousands of people lived in Beringia for 10,000 years, why is the evidence of their long stay so scarce? We find tiny clues, some microblades, the occasional bone tool, perhaps a few scattered campfires dated to that period, but nothing that suggests a continuous, vibrant culture spanning millennia. Where are the massive trash piles, Where are the burial grounds? Where are the settlements that must have existed to sustain a culture for this long? Academically, we explain it away. We say that the most critical settlements, those along the now submerged coastlines, were swallowed by the rising sea when the ice melted. We argue that they were highly nomadic, leaving little behind, and that their tools were often made of perishable materials like hide and wood. All of that is true, but perhaps there is a darker truth hidden in the silence. Perhaps the sheer brutality of the environment, the forced reliance on perfect, unchanging efficiency, meant that the culture that emerged was so profoundly stripped down, so ruthlessly pragmatic, that it left no monuments. No need for complex art, no massive social hierarchies, just the pure, honed discipline of survival. They became the perfect predator for the new land they would eventually inherit. And when that gate finally, irrevocably opened, when the ice melted enough to expose the interior path, or the coastal highway finally thawed, the people who stepped out were genetically identical to those who went in, but culturally they were transformed. They had been incubated in the cold darkness, honed into the most efficient continental colonizers the world had ever seen. But first, we have to look at how that exit happened and what that first journey into the pristine, unpeopled Americas actually looked like. Because that initial sprint south wasn't merely a migration, it was an explosion. And the speed with which they moved suggests that they weren't searching for a home, but fleeing a memory of the isolation that nearly consumed them. Remember that ice we talked about? The two giant continental sheets, the Cordilleran in the west and the Laurentide chewing up the east? They didn't just vanish politely. When the planet decided it was done with the last glacial maximum, the meltdown was catastrophic. We're talking about a landscape that was shattered, waterlogged, and constantly unstable. For the people who had been waiting, this was not a triumphant opening of the gates. It was the appearance of a terrifying opportunity. The end of the standstill was signaled by the roar of meltwater rivers the size of inland seas, carving channels through sludge and gravel, shaking the very earth they walked on. The world was remaking itself, and they had to move or be swallowed by the rising oceans that would soon drown the land bridge completely. So, how did they leave? This is where the archaeology gets fiercely interesting, and where we, as modern observers, are forced to reckon with the sheer tenacity of those ancestors. For decades, the standard theory, the great American origin story, was the ice-free corridor. Imagine two impossibly tall, mile-thick walls of ice retreating just enough to leave a narrow, winding, 900-mile-long alleyway running right down the spine of the continent from modern Yukon into Alberta. It sounds like salvation, right? A path forged by geological necessity. But here is the brutal reality. We now know, based on detailed geological dating, that this corridor was likely impassable, a desolate, frozen highway of mud and frigid lakes until maybe 13,000 or 12,600 years ago. And here is the problem. We have established sites deep in South America, like Monteverde in Chile, that are older than that. Far older. This means that the first wave of human expansion into the Americas could not have gone through the middle of the continent. They had to choose the other route, the route of profound terror and skill, the coastal migration. Think about the skill set honed in Beringia. They weren't just terrestrial hunters anymore, they were coastal people. They learned to live off the sea using rudimentary watercraft, maybe hide-covered boats, perhaps precursors to the kayaks developed millennia later, to hunt seals, fish, and follow the abundant resources of the kelp highway. Right. You are stepping out of the isolation chamber and immediately launching yourself onto the most volatile, unpredictable environment on Earth, the open, cold Pacific coast. Imagine that journey. It is not romantic. It is weeks, months, maybe years, hugging the coast of a land you've never seen, where mountains plunge directly into the sea, where tidal waves are a constant threat, and where fog swallows the shoreline whole for days on end. Your very existence depends on the stability of a narrow biological band. the kelp forests, and coastal estuaries that act like biological superhighways, rich in food. They were moving fast, propelled by the success of their specialized hunting culture, but also perhaps driven by that intangible memory of isolation we talked about. They couldn't go back. The bridge was dissolving behind them. They had to press on. The archaeological data supports this explosion. Within what seems like the blink of an eye, maybe 1,000 years, humans appear everywhere, from the Pacific Northwest down to the southern tip of Chile. This isn't just movement, it's a continental sprint, and the clearest signature of this successful sprint, the calling card that announces the arrival of the honed, perfect Beringian hunters, is the appearance of the most sophisticated killing tool the world had ever seen up to that point, the sai. Clovis Point arrows. If you've ever held a replica of a Clovis Point, you understand its deadly beauty. It is an artifact of profound engineering efficiency. Named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, these projectile points are distinctive. They are finely flaked, extremely sharp, and feature a characteristic flute or channel carved out of the base. That flute wasn't for decoration. It was a functional innovation, allowing the point to be expertly hafted, attached to a spear shaft, creating a deadly weapon that could withstand the shock of piercing thick hide and bone. This toolkit, Clovis technology, didn't evolve slowly on the American plains. It appears fully formed, almost simultaneously, across vast swathes of the continent immediately after the coastal pioneers found their footing inland. Now, we need to be precise here. The discovery of pre-Clovis sites, like that one in Chile, tells us that the very first settlers might have been small, isolated groups moving quietly down the coast. But the Clovis people, the inheritors of the Beringian pause, they were the colonists. They were the dominant, technologically superior group that cemented human occupation. They were, quite simply, the most effective megafauna hunters the world had ever produced. They had spent 20,000 years perfecting the art of survival in the harshest possible conditions, minimizing waste, maximizing yield, and operating with ruthless efficiency. And when they stepped into the pristine interior of North America, when they finally broke free of the isolation, they encountered a biological paradise, a world teeming with animals that had evolved for millions of years without ever encountering a predator armed with such intelligence, organization, and a weapon designed to kill efficiently at range. You must realize the scope of the tension here. The most adapted, ruthless hunter in human history suddenly stands face to face with the American megafauna. It was a world still defined by giants. Woolly mammoths that dwarfed modern elephants, giant short-faced bears that could run down a horse, mastodons browsing the forests, and the American lion, even bigger than its African cousin. These animals had never known fear like this. Their evolutionary programming had no defense against the precision, the organization, and the sheer technological superiority of the newly arrived human. We often imagine the settlers as desperate wanderers, but once they broke the geographical constraints, they were conquerors. And what followed that initial meeting, that sudden collision between perfect predator and naive prey, was one of the fastest and most devastating extinction events in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It was a conquest so swift, so complete, that when we look back at the fossil record, the question isn't if humans were responsible for the megafaunal die-off, but rather how they did it so quickly, and whether the memory of their arrival is still imprinted on the land they inherited, the land they literally emptied of giants. If we accept the brutal truth that a small, technologically advanced population decimated an entire continent's worth of giants in what felt like the historical blink of an eye, we have to stop looking at the prey and start looking at the tools. We have to analyze the crime scene because you simply don't achieve that level of biological cleansing using blunt sticks and desperation. No, this required mastery. This required engineering. When we talk about the first definitive culture to sweep across the Americas, we are talking about Clovis. And when we talk about Clovis, We are talking about a very specific, terrifyingly effective piece of technology, the fluted point. Now, you might be thinking, it's just a sharp rock, right? Absolutely not. This spear point, often made of chert, obsidian, or high-grade quartz, was a masterpiece of lithic engineering. It wasn't merely chipped, it was fluted. Imagine taking a razor-sharp 6-inch blade and delicately removing a long thin flake from the base on both sides. This creates a channel, a groove, which allowed the point to be slotted deep into a handle or spear shaft and tied securely, ensuring that when the weapon struck a mastodon's thick hide or a giant bison's shoulder blade, the force transfer was perfect, and the point wouldn't snap off prematurely. This was precision warfare. This technology wasn't some local invention that popped up in isolation. Archaeological evidence shows that wherever the ice sheets retreated, wherever the pioneers went, these points followed. From the high plains of Montana down to the jungles of Central America, they were using the same basic, highly specialized blueprint. This tells us two critical things about the people who first settled the Americas. First, they were deeply connected. We are not looking at scattered bands of refugees wandering aimlessly. We are looking at a coherent cultural movement, sharing advanced trade secrets across thousands of miles. They were organized. Second, they were hyper-specialized for big game hunting. Their entire cultural identity, their technological investment, was geared towards one purpose: taking down giants. They had weapons designed not just to kill, but to overkill. This is where the idea of the blitzkrieg hunting strategy comes in. Picture the scene: a herd of mammoths, perhaps 10 or 15 animals. They are large, yes, but slow-witted regarding human threats. They had spent millions of years evolving defenses against wolves and saber-tooths. But humans, we are tiny, we are fast, and we kill from a distance using coordinated strategy. The hunters didn't need to kill every animal, or even most of them. They just needed to kill the lead bull, the matriarch, and maybe a few others. What happens then? Panic. The remaining animals, without their leaders, scatter, confused and vulnerable, often trapped in canyons or driven off cliffs, a practice documented in later cultures that inherited this deadly knowledge. It wasn't just about efficiency. It was about exploitation of ignorance. The megafauna had no fear, and therefore no effective defense. They didn't see us as a threat until the fluted point was already embedded deep in their lungs. But here is the question that always brings us back to the great mystery. If these people were such masterful engineers, such efficient predators, with such a coherent, shared culture across a massive continent, they didn't just, becoming that way, crossing a flimsy land bridge. That level of refinement requires centuries of continuous pressure and intense specialization. Where did this crucible exist? Where did humanity hide for so long, forging this perfect weapon and hardening this unparalleled skill set? We must return to Beringia. Not the icy bridge you cross quickly, but the vast, sunken continent that was their home for 20 millennia. This stretch of land, twice the size of modern Texas, was the waiting room, the place historians and geneticists now call the Beringian Standstill. It was the genetic and cultural incubation chamber for virtually all the indigenous peoples of the Americas. During the height of the last ice age, two massive continental ice sheets, the Laurentide in the east and the Cordilleran in the west, grew so large that they sealed off the American interior. They were like two enormous, unmoving walls of ice, creating a prison without bars. For thousands upon thousands of years, the pioneers who had crossed from Siberia were trapped. We often imagine Beringia as a uniform frozen wasteland, but that's inaccurate. It was what scientists call a refugium, a polar desert, a wind-scoured, grassy steppe that supported specialized megafauna, the woolly rhinoceros, the short-faced bear, and the hardy extinct steppe bison. It was a bleak, challenging existence, defined by extreme cold and scarcity of wood, forcing reliance on bone and specialized stone tools. Crucially, This isolation was absolute. These small populations, perhaps numbering only a few thousand total souls, had zero contact with Asia or the rest of the world. They were cut off, locked away, subject to intense genetic drift and immense selective pressure. Every single decision they made, every tool they invented was tested by the harshest survival environment on the planet. There was no room for error. A flawed spear design meant death. A poor hunting strategy meant starvation for the entire band. They didn't just survive the standstill, they perfected themselves. They lived under a constant state of evolutionary stress, refining their genetics, their language, and their technology in total silence, hidden from the world. When we look at the unique genetic markers that define all ancestral indigenous populations in the Americas today, we see the fingerprint of this isolation. We see 10,000, maybe 15,000, perhaps even 20,000 years of solitude imprinted on their very being. They entered Beringia as Asian wanderers, and they emerged whenever that great ice corridor finally opened as something fundamentally new. They emerged as the ultimate conquerors. But here is the core of the mystery we still need to unlock. What else happened during those 200 centuries of darkness? What knowledge did they acquire that made them instantly superior to every other animal in the hemisphere? We have to look deeper into the ice, deeper into the genes, to figure out what they sacrificed, what they learned, and what dark secret they carried out of Beringia when they finally heard the earth whisper, "Go." We talk about this 20,000-year solitude, but that number is meaningless until you try to visualize the actual reality of the prison. This wasn't some barren, featureless Antarctica where life was impossible. That's what makes the story so much more terrifying. This was a place where life was just possible enough to keep them trapped. Imagine a landmass the size of Australia, maybe bigger, connected to Asia, but totally isolated from the rest of North America by walls of continental ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran. Sheets that stood 2 kilometers high. We were stuck in the middle in a geographical and ecological refugee camp we call Beringia. This land wasn't forest, it wasn't tundra as we know it today. It was the mammoth steppe. Forget trees, forget coastal diversity. This was a vast, windswept, dry grassland. And its key characteristic was its biological richness, but specialized richness. It was a factory for producing enormous herbivores, the woolly mammoths, the steppe bison, ancient musk oxen, giant camels, and wild horses. These were walking, breathing protein sources that could, and often did, crush you with a careless step. To survive here, generation after generation, meant that their culture could not afford mistakes. They couldn't afford weakness. Survival was not about diversity of skills, it was about hyper-specialization. They had to be more intimately familiar with the migration paths of these colossal beasts than with their own children. They had to anticipate the ice melt, the sudden blizzards, and the exact weaknesses of the biggest creatures on Earth. If they stopped inventing, they died. If they missed a single migration cycle, they starved. This pressure cooker environment shows up clearly when geneticists analyze the DNA of modern indigenous populations across the Americas. The genes themselves scream a story of incredible sustained pressure. They tell us that the entire population that populated 2 continents originated from an extremely small, core group of individuals who survived that standstill. We call this event a genetic bottleneck. For thousands of years, the total breeding population was tiny. The academic estimates vary, but we are talking about maybe a few thousand individuals, perhaps even fewer, who carried the destiny of the entire hemisphere in their mitochondrial DNA. Think about the sheer, suffocating psychological weight of that existence. You see? Every birth, every pairing, every successful hunt carried a catastrophic importance. If your family line died out, you weren't just losing your family. you were extinguishing an entire potential branch of the human future. There was zero room for error, zero redundancy, and yet they did not just survive, they thrived in the shadows. This wasn't downtime. This was a 20,000-year involuntary research and development project, forging an entirely new approach to hunting and survival. We don't find a lot of physical archaeological evidence directly in the middle of this deep Beringian phase, largely because much of the crucial land, the coastlines they might have followed, is now miles underwater, submerged beneath a risen sea. But the tools they carried out of Beringia when they finally migrated are the irrefutable evidence of their success. They emerged carrying a technology so effective, so rapidly disseminated across the new hemisphere, that archaeologists gave it a name that echoes across the centuries: Clovis. The Clovis point is not just a spear tip, it is the ultimate expression of specialized, lethal ingenuity built for efficiency and penetration. It allowed those who carried it to rapidly colonize any environment they encountered, providing an immediate and decisive edge over everything else alive. And this technology didn't just pop into existence one sunny afternoon south of the glaciers. It was forged, refined, and perfected during those 200 centuries of isolation. It was the answer to the mammoth. But what did they sacrifice? What happens to a culture that only knows vast, empty space, lethal cold, and the necessity of constant, unwavering focus on the hunt? They must have developed a profound, cold fatalism. They learned to read the sky, the ice, the wind, and the migration patterns of massive beasts with an intimacy that we, living in climate-controlled environments, simply cannot fathom. The line between spirituality and practical survival became non-existent. Their rituals, their language, their entire cosmology must have revolved around the brutal certainty of the next meal and the overwhelming uncertainty of the next season. This wasn't merely history we're observing, it was the crucible that forged the deepest human character traits of the continent's first peoples: resilience, adaptability, and an unparalleled understanding of the natural world. And then, finally, after 20 millennia of successful self-containment, the world outside began to change. The massive North American ice sheets, that impenetrable wall they had lived alongside for so long, began their slow, agonizing, but unstoppable retreat. The planet was warming. This wasn't a sudden dramatic gate opening like in a Hollywood movie. It was gradual, wet, muddy, and dangerous. But somewhere between 15,000 and 14,000 years ago, that single, narrow, treacherous corridor of ice-free land began to snake its way south, down through the heart of the continent. It was a lifeline and a promise whispered through the glacial roar. They had successfully survived the isolation. Now, they faced the terrifying choice: stay in the known purgatory of Beringia, where they were masters, or step through that muddy, unpredictable gap and into the vast unknown south. The genetic evidence tells us when they moved and where they went. But the archaeology demands we ask, when they finally heard that whisper, when they saw the opening, what triggered the decision to leave all at once? And more critically, when they finally walked out, how quickly did they conquer it all? Because the speed of the conquest is, perhaps, the most shocking secret of Beringia. We left them standing at the mouth of the gap. The ice was receding, the ground was turning from permafrost to mud, and the air smelled like rain and fresh life. Not just frozen death. The choice, remember, was terrifying. Stay in the known purgatory of Beringia or step into the unknown. But the evidence suggests that once the decision was made, or perhaps once the population pressure became too great, they didn't just step, they flew. If you try to trace their steps, you quickly run into the biggest, loudest argument in American archaeology. Because when we talk about the initial entry into the Deep South, the American continents themselves, we aren't talking about one single, muddy path. We are talking about two monumental avenues of entry, and figuring out which one they took first, and why, has been the holy grail of this science for decades. Path number 1, the Ice-Free Corridor, IFC, This is the classic theory, the one taught in textbooks for most of the 20th century. Imagine walking south through a massive, terrifying canyon thousands of miles long. On your right, the gigantic Laurentide ice sheet. On your left, the equally monstrous Cordilleran sheet. This corridor was only viable for migration roughly between 15,000 and 14,000 years ago, and even then it would have been a hellish journey. A cold, windswept, geographically unstable gauntlet. But here's the advantage of the IFC. If it opened, it would have been a funnel for megafauna. It was the expressway for woolly mammoths, extinct giant bison, and caribou. For people who had perfected high-risk, high-reward hunting in the icebox of Beringia, this route offered everything they needed to sustain a serious southward push. It was inland, it was deadly, but it was direct. Path number 2, the Pacific Coastal Route. The Kelp Highway. This theory is much harder to prove, and that is precisely why many scholars now believe it is the more likely candidate for the very first wave. Think about it. If you were trapped in Beringia, you were already adapted to maritime living. You were near the coast, eating seals, fish, and birds. Why suddenly turn inland to face 2-mile-high glaciers when you could follow the coast? The coast, even during the peak of the Ice Age, offered stable, temperate resources. Kelp forests, shellfish, marine mammals. A relative paradise compared to the interior. The problem, for us 21st century researchers, is that the sea levels were far lower back then. As the glaciers melted, the sea rose, drowning the entire ancient coastline, the beaches, the camps, the boat landings, everything. The evidence of the first coastal settlers now sits hundreds of feet underwater. We know the coastal route was eventually used. We have archaeological sites in South America, like Monteverde in Chile, that appear to predate the guaranteed opening of the IFC, which suggests that the first pioneering wave used boats hugging the coast, leapfrogging down the continent with staggering efficiency. Whether they came inland or coastal, the effect was the same. Sometime around 13,500 years ago, calibrated, a specific archaeological signature lights up the continent like a flare, the Clovis culture. And this is where the speed of the conquest becomes the secret that defines them. When we talk about Clovis, we are talking about an entire complex of tools, but primarily, we are talking about one piece of perfect, terrifying technology, the Clovis point. If you've ever seen one, that beautiful, fluted spearhead, meticulously crafted, thin and deadly, you understand you're not looking at a primitive stone tool. You're looking at the culmination of the Beringian experiment. They didn't arrive with chipped rocks. They arrived with high-end, standardized, specialized killing equipment. The Clovis point is instantly recognizable, and here is the profound, shocking revelation of the archaeological record. Clovis appears everywhere at once. We find Clovis points in Texas, New Mexico, Florida, California, and Mexico, all appearing within a window of perhaps 500 to 1,000 years. Now, in human history, 1,000 years is nothing. It's a blink. Imagine a group of people leaving North Alaska or Beringia. They had to traverse thousands of miles of brand new, ecologically complex territory, mountains, deserts, forests. They faced zero maps, zero trails, and hostile, alien environments compared to their frozen home. Yet, in that incredibly brief geological instant, they established themselves as the dominant cultural force across an area larger than Europe. Think about the sheer dispersal rate. Previous human migrations, like the one that colonized Europe after the ice retreated, were slow, careful, and often took thousands of years just to move across a single large ecological zone. The ancestors of the Native Americans, after their 20,000-year incubation, achieved a population and cultural dispersion that was, by comparison, warp speed. They weren't just following game trails, they were conquering ecosystems. They were mastering river systems, mountain passes, and adapting their Clovis technology to hunt everything from the giant short-faced bear to the last remaining herds of mammoth. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of explosion. They walked out of that corridor, be it ice or kelp, and immediately claimed the whole damn thing. Why? What fueled this immediate, relentless drive south? One theory suggests the standstill created a profound population bottleneck. For 20,000 years, their genetics tightened, their population capacity maxed out, and their technology perfected. When the gates finally opened, they didn't have the luxury of slow expansion. It was a massive wave, a human and technological tsunami forced outward by pent-up pressure. They entered a world untouched by human hands, a world that was fat, happy, and utterly unprepared for the arrival of the most efficient, hyper-specialized apex predator Earth had yet produced. The speed of their conquest poses a terrifying question, one we cannot ignore. What happened when this hyper-efficient, technologically advanced force, honed by the darkest, coldest history imaginable, met a vulnerable, unsuspecting world full of giant, slow, delicious targets? The archaeological record shows us that the Clovis arrival coincided with disturbing precision with one of the greatest ecological catastrophes in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They stepped out of the ice, and the megafauna began to vanish. Was this simply a coincidence of climate change? Or was the conquest of the continent fueled by a deliberate, aggressive erasure of everything that stood in their way? You look at the archaeological map of the Americas, and you see a flicker, a sudden burst of light originating somewhere near the ancient ice-free corridor, or perhaps tracking the Pacific coast. Then, that light spreads, not like spilled water, but like wildfire across dry prairie. This wasn't a gentle diffusion of people. This was a purposeful, calculated conquest. And when we talk about the speed of this colonization, from the Arctic Circle down to the tip of Chile, roughly 13,500 to 12,000 years ago, we are talking about geological speed, not human speed. This continent was effectively settled in an archaeological instant. So, the question remains, demanding an answer, built only on bone and stone. How did they do it? We have to look at the weapon. The tool of choice for the people we call Clovis is the fluted projectile point. If you want to understand the dark history of the Americas, you must hold one of these in your mind's eye. It is not just a sharpened rock. It is a masterpiece of specialized, optimized killing technology perfected during those 20,000 years of intense, hyper-competitive isolation in Beringia. Think about it. The flute, that channel removed from the base, wasn't for decoration. It was advanced engineering designed to solve a fatal problem. How to reliably attach a fragile stone tip to a durable wooden shaft so that the entire assembly, spear or dart, doesn't fail when it strikes the ribcage of a 6-ton beast covered in thick hide. And fat. The flute allows for deeper seating, better shock absorption, and maximized penetration. It's the difference between a clumsy wooden club and a precision-engineered bullet. This technological leap gave the humans an advantage that the megafauna of the Americas simply had no defense against. You see, for millions of years, the North American giants, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the enormous short-faced bears, they had been evolving in a world where the greatest threat was typically another animal the size of a truck. Their defense mechanisms were brute force, thick hide, and massive tusks. Their predator defense protocols were built for creatures that hunted by stealth, strength, and smell. They had never, not once, encountered anything like us. We are persistence hunters, capable of running down prey until it collapses from heat exhaustion. We hunt in highly coordinated, highly intelligent packs. And critically, we possessed the capacity for culture and communication that allowed us to transmit lethal knowledge, like exactly where to place that fluted spear point for the maximum effect from generation to generation, rapidly, without requiring biological evolution. The evolutionary arms race that had defined life in Eurasia, the constant back and forth between human hunters and cautious prey, had not happened here. When the Beringians walked out of the ice, the animals they met were naive. They lacked the instinctive terror-fueled flight response that their counterparts in Africa and Eurasia had developed after hundreds of thousands of years of human persecution. Imagine being able to walk right up to a creature that size, a creature whose flesh could feed your entire band for a month, and having it regard you with curiosity rather than fear. This is the terrifying core of the academic theory known as the overkill hypothesis, or, more dramatically, the Pleistocene blitzkrieg. Now, you and I have to be careful here. We are historians, not sensationalists. We must acknowledge that this narrative is fiercely debated in the ivory towers. The competing theory is that massive climate change, specifically the rapid, tumultuous shifts associated with the Younger Dryas period, stressed the megafauna beyond the point of sustainability. The ice sheets melted and reformed, habitats fragmented, and specialized grazers starved. But here is the horrifying synthesis we can't ignore. It wasn't one or the other. It was a perfect, deadly storm. Think of it this way. Climate change softened the target. It put pressure on the environment, reducing the resilience and population density of the megafauna, forcing them into smaller, predictable geographical refugees. And then, at that precise moment of maximum vulnerability, the most efficient predator the world had ever seen arrived, armed with the culmination of Ice Age ingenuity. The Clovis people weren't just surviving, they were prosecuting a military campaign against the entire ecological structure of the continent. And their success wasn't measured in battles won, but in species erased. We see the evidence in the radiocarbon dates. As the Clovis presence rapidly expands across the continent, you see the sudden, sharp, and non-random disappearance of nearly 70 genera of large mammals. The timing is too neat, too precise, to dismiss as coincidence. The arrival of human beings is the single unifying factor across this entire event horizon. They followed the game. They pursued the mammoths and the mastodons, not just because they needed the meat, but because the successful elimination of the largest animals freed up vast tracts of land and vegetation for the smaller, more manageable game they would rely on later. They were aggressively simplifying the ecosystem to suit their needs. Imagine the psychological and physical intensity required to maintain this wave of expansion. They weren't migrating aimlessly. They were pushing, driven forward by relentless population growth and the need for new, untouched hunting grounds. Every community was racing the clock, knowing that the resources behind them were diminishing, forcing them to be pioneers in the darkest sense of the word. They conquered a hemisphere faster than the Romans conquered the Mediterranean. It was an endless, adrenaline-fueled slaughter. The very foundation of what would become the New World was built on a catastrophe of bone and blood. And then it stopped. The giants were gone. The great thunder of the mammoth herds faded into silence. What happens to a culture when the very creatures that define their technology, their success, and their worldview are suddenly extinct? What happens to the apex predator when it runs out of targets? The world they emerged into had vanished, and the hyper-specialized Clovis hunters found themselves facing a profound, frightening truth. They had won the war, but they had fundamentally destroyed the battlefield. They stood victorious on a continent that now looked strangely empty, forced to completely reinvent themselves in the shadow of their own devastating success. The secret of Beringia was that it forged the perfect killer. The tragedy of the Americas is what happened when that killer ran out of things to kill. And the memory of that loss, that mass vanishing, would shape the spiritual and practical lives of their descendants for the next 12,000 years. We left them standing on a continent of ghosts, didn't we? The colossal shadow of the great hunt had been replaced by a silence so deep it must have tasted like ash. The Clovis world, the peak of the specialized terrestrial megafauna hunter, was over. It was an evolutionary dead end, born of devastating success. And here is where we see the true, staggering genius of the people forged in Beringia, their deep, inherent capacity for adaptation. They didn't die out. They shattered. They changed everything. You see, the people who emerged from that icy isolation were not monolithic. Their skills were universal, but their implementation was instantaneous and brilliant. When the mammoths went silent, some turned to the water, becoming the ancestors of the expert coastal fishers and mariners. Some turned south and west, learning the deep secrets of the deserts, becoming masters of small game and highly specific flora, the people who would eventually give us agriculture in the southwest. Others stayed on the plains, but shifted their focus entirely, focusing on the fast, smaller herds of bison that survived the Great Die-Off, leading directly to the cultures of the Great Plains. They stopped being the apex predator, defined by one target, and became the ultimate omnivore, defined by opportunity. They decentralized. They diversified. In the space of 2,000 years, the single, generalized culture of the early immigrants fractured into the thousands of distinct languages, diets, and worldviews that characterized North and South America before contact. But let's circle back one final time to the secret that defined them, the riddle of their origin, Beringia. For decades, this was just a theory, a neat way to explain how people got here. But the archaeological sites and the geological evidence only told us when they arrived. They couldn't tell us what happened during that critical incubation period. Now we have the answer, and it is perhaps the most profound revelation of 21st century archaeology. We have ancient DNA. We can sequence the genomes of these early ancestors, and the narrative they tell confirms every gut feeling the archaeologists had about this frozen land. The genetic clock shows that the population ancestral to virtually all indigenous peoples of the Americas separated from their Siberian kin somewhere around 25,000 to 23,000 years ago. This is the moment they stopped interacting with the main Asian gene pool. But here is the kicker. Genetic analysis reveals a profound, prolonged bottleneck event. Their population size remained small, isolated, and highly specialized for millennia. The genetic divergence data confirms that the ancestors of Native Americans, the entire ancestral population, remained genetically stagnant and geographically isolated from both Asia and the Americas for perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 years. We were right. The Beringian Standstill wasn't a quick layover. It was a genetic isolation chamber, a crucible of ice, bone, and survival. This explains the astonishing speed and completeness of the colonization once the gates opened. By the time the coastal and inland corridors finally thawed and became passable, sometime around 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, the people who poured out weren't just random Siberian nomads. They were a population already perfectly adapted to the unique environment of the New World, carrying the distinct genetic markers and the ultra-specialized toolkits necessary to survive anywhere from the Arctic tundra to the tropical rainforests. They didn't colonize America. They were released into it. Think about the sheer, mind-bending scale of this journey. We are talking about 25,000 years of history defined by trauma and tenacity. We tracked a single lineage through 3 separate worlds: the Siberian homeland, the glacial prison of Beringia, and finally, the colossal, empty continents of the Americas. This story we have followed: the crossing, the isolation, the specialization, and the devastation. This is the fundamental origin myth of a hemisphere. It is the story that underlies every subsequent development, every myth, and every spiritual connection to the land that followed. Because the people who built the great mound cities like Cahokia, the people who developed sophisticated astronomy in the Puebloan Southwest, the people who carved the totem poles on the Pacific Northwest coast, they were all the great-great-grandchildren of the men and women who stood on the edge of the ice sheet, waiting for the path to clear. They all carried the shared DNA memory of that endless cold wait. We like to think of human history in neat, manageable chunks: antiquity, the Middle Ages, the modern era. But the story of the first Americans requires us to adjust our chronological lens entirely. 12,000 years passed between the extinction of the mammoths and the arrival of the first European ships. 12,000 years of continuous, evolving, brilliant adaptation. That is a depth of history that dwarfs the entire documented trajectory of Western civilization. And yet, it is a history often treated as static, as a prologue that ended when Columbus arrived. But the trauma of Beringia, the long silence, the desperate struggle, the victory that led to the death of the very things they hunted, that is the foundational trauma. It informed the sacred reverence for the few remaining herd animals. It informed the deep, existential understanding of environmental fragility. It shaped the people who would face the next and far more devastating extinction event, the arrival of outsiders. We began this journey by asking the secret of Beringia. We have found it not in glittering artifacts, but in bone and blood and ice. The secret was that for 10 millennia, we hid. We waited. We specialized. We became something new. And when we finally emerged, we inherited an entire world. It is the longest, coldest, and perhaps the most brutal success story in the history of human migration. Look at us, following the ghost footprints across a land bridge that no longer exists, peering into the shadows of a profound past. The ice is gone now, the bridge is underwater, and the giants are only fossils. But the people who survived that incredible ordeal, they are still here. And their tenacity, forged in the relentless cold of a forgotten world, remains the most enduring human truth of the Americas. This is where our journey ends. The ice has broken. The world awaits.